The train screeched to a halt at Pine Ridge Station, Wyoming Territory, 1890. Steam billowed across the weathered platform, momentarily obscuring the vast, unforgiving landscape beyond. When it cleared, only one passenger remained, a woman in a simple navy dress standing ramrod straight despite the 13-hour journey from Cheyenne. Grace Whitmore clutched her medical bag with white knuckles, scanning the empty platform. Her other possessions were pitifully few: one carpet bag and a small trunk. At 32, the lines around her eyes spoke of someone who had witnessed too much suffering. Yet there remained a quiet determination in her gaze that even the harshest frontier couldn't diminish. She was too late to notice the three men who had staggered aboard 3 stations back, already deep in whiskey before noon. Their laughter had grown louder with each mile until it filled the rail car like smoke. When the largest one lurched toward her seat, whiskey breath hot against her neck, Grace had not screamed. Instead, she'd reached into her medical bag with practiced calm. "I wouldn't," she said quietly, revealing a surgical needle poised between her fingers. "Tetanus is a terrible way to die." The man's bloodshot eyes widened. An elderly passenger attempted to intervene, only to be shoved roughly back into his seat. Just then the train lurched forward, wheels screaming against metal. Grace used that momentum, planting her boot against the man's shin and pushing him backward. He toppled into his companions as Grace grabbed her bags and moved swiftly to another car, heart hammering but face composed. Now she stood alone on the platform, her sleeve torn at the seam, a small cut on her forearm slowly seeping blood into the dusty white fabric. She hadn't bothered to tend it. After 4 years as a nurse during the war between the states, such minor injuries barely registered. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice came from the shadows of the station house, deep, graveled by years of hard living. A tall figure emerged, moving with the careful gait of a man nursing old wounds. Colonel Everett Mallister, 52 years of age according to his letters, wore a weathered cavalry hat that shaded piercing blue eyes. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to the edge of his jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-grimace. "Miss Whitmore," she corrected, extending her hand formally, "though I believe I was corresponding with Timothy Mallister." The man's face remained impassive as he took her hand. His grip was firm but gentle, the careful handshake of someone accustomed to measuring his strength. "Tim was my brother," he said, the past tense hanging between them like a gallows rope. Grace felt her stomach drop. "Was? Tuberculosis. 6 months ago." He spoke without emotion, as if reciting facts from a military report. Then his eyes caught the torn sleeve, the dried blood. "You're injured." "It's nothing," Grace said. But Colonel Mallister was already removing his coat, a faded Union blue that had seen better days. He draped it over her shoulders without asking permission, covering the torn dress. "Wagons this way," he said, lifting her trunk with ease despite his apparent limp. "Long ride ahead." As they walked, Grace fought to keep her voice steady. "Colonel, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Your brother and I arranged—" "I know what you arranged," he interrupted, helping her onto the wagon bench. "Tim wrote to you about homesteading, about needing a wife with medical knowledge." He clicked his tongue, setting the horses in motion. Tim always did have more dreams than sense. They rode in silence for several minutes. The town of Pine Ridge, little more than a church, general store, and saloon, quickly disappearing behind them. The landscape opened into rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of pine. In the distance, mountains cut a jagged line against the impossibly blue sky. "Why didn't you write to inform me of his passing?" Grace finally asked. Mallister kept his eyes on the trail. "No telegraph to the homestead. By the time I made it to town to send word, you'd already left Philadelphia." He paused. "I figured you'd want your train fare back. I brought it." Grace stared at his profile, noting the stubborn set of his jaw. "I didn't come all this way for a refund, Colonel." "Then why did you come, Miss Whitmore?" He glanced at her, those blue eyes sharp with assessment. "Wyoming Territory isn't kind to city women. I was born in Kentucky, raised in Virginia, and spent 4 years following Union Army camps," she replied evenly. "The battlefield hospital at Antietam had more mud and misery than your entire territory could muster." A ghost of something, surprise perhaps, flickered across his face. "You were a war nurse." "I was." She straightened her spine. "Your brother mentioned you served with the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Prestigious unit." "That was a lifetime ago." "Was it? You still wear the coat." His hands tightened on the reins. Force of habit. The wagon crested a hill, revealing a valley spread below like a faded quilt. A small cabin stood nestled against a rocky outcropping, smoke curling from its chimney. A half-constructed barn and corral stood nearby, and beyond stretched fields marked by furrows but showing only the barest hint of green. "Tim's homestead," Mallister said. "My homestead now, I suppose." "It looks challenging," Grace offered diplomatically. A harsh laugh escaped him. "That's one word for it. 160 acres of the most stubborn land God ever created." Tim was convinced it would be the foundation of a medical practice serving the valley. He shook his head. Fool's errand. "Your brother's letters suggested otherwise," Grace countered. "He wrote of fertile soil and abundant water." Tim wrote what he hoped, not what was. Mallister's voice softened almost imperceptibly. He always did. As they approached the homestead, Grace noted the careful construction of the cabin. Solid logs chinked with clay, a proper stone chimney. Whatever his faults, Timothy Mallister had not been careless with his craftsmanship. "You have two options, Miss Whitmore," the colonel said as he halted the wagon. "Stay the night, rest from your journey, and I'll take you back to Pine Ridge tomorrow with your fare refunded. Or," he hesitated. "Or?" she prompted. "Or you can honor whatever agreement you had with my brother. The homestead claim has 17 months left before proving up. Tim's will left it to me, but with my condition." He didn't elaborate on what condition that might be. "I could use a partner with medical knowledge, someone to help make this place what Tim imagined." Grace studied him, this weathered soldier with his permanent scowl and carefully measured words. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Colonel, or marriage?" "Business," he answered immediately. "You get half interest in the homestead. I get a fighting chance to fulfill my brother's last wish. And if I choose to leave, then you leave. No hard feelings." Grace stepped down from the wagon without assistance, feeling the solid earth beneath her boots. She surveyed the homestead again, seeing the challenge it presented. Part of her, the sensible part, screamed to take the return fare and find a proper hospital position back east. But another part, the part that had volunteered for the battlefield hospitals when other women fled, recognized opportunity in the struggle before her, a chance to build something that belonged entirely to herself. "I'll stay the night," she decided, "and give you my answer in the morning." Colonel Mallister nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing different. "Fair enough." The cabin's interior surprised her. Though small, it was meticulously organized, with a cast-iron stove, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with books, many of them medical texts. A curtain partitioned off what she assumed was a sleeping area. "Tim's medical supplies," Mallister said, gesturing to a cabinet against one wall. "Ordered them special from Chicago. Cost a month's savings." Grace opened the cabinet to find an impressive array of instruments, tinctures, and bandages. Far better than what she'd had during the war. "Your brother was serious about his practice." "Tim was serious about everything," Mallister replied. "Coffee?" She nodded, watching as he moved around the cabin with military precision, heating water and measuring grounds with practice motions. Despite his limp, he wasted no movement. "You've been ill," she observed clinically. His hand paused momentarily. "What makes you say that?" "The way you conserve energy, the slight tremor in your left hand, the fact that you've lost weight recently, your clothes hang loose." Mallister poured their coffee, setting a steaming cup before her. "Tim mentioned you were observant." "It's tuberculosis, isn't it?" she pressed. "The same as your brother." He met her gaze steadily. "Consumption runs in families, they say." "How advanced?" "Doctor in Cheyenne gave me 2 years, maybe less." Grace sipped her coffee, mind racing. "This complicated matters significantly. You didn't mention that in your proposal. Would it have changed your answer?" "I haven't given my answer yet," she reminded him. She set down her cup. "May I examine you, professionally?" A wry smile touched his lips. "Most women ask permission before moving into a man's home, not before listening to his lungs." "I'm not most women, Colonel." "No," he agreed, "you certainly aren't." He gestured toward his chest. "Examine away, Miss Whitmore." Grace retrieved her medical bag, removing her stethoscope. She placed it against his back, instructing him to breathe deeply. The rattling in his lungs confirmed her suspicion, though it wasn't as severe as she'd feared. "Early stages," she concluded. "With proper treatment and care, you might have considerably longer than 2 years." "Is that professional opinion or frontier optimism?" "I don't deal in optimism, Colonel. Only facts." He buttoned his shirt, studying her with renewed interest. "And does this fact change your mind about our arrangement?" Grace moved to the window, gazing out at the land as twilight settled over it. The challenges were immense: hostile terrain, isolation, and now a chronically ill partner. Yet something in her responded to this place, to its wild beauty and harsh honesty. "I lost my fiancé at Gettysburg," she said quietly, her back still to him. "My parents to typhoid the year after. I have no family left in Philadelphia, only a hospital position where they still treat female nurses as little more than maids with medical pretensions." She turned to face him. "Your brother offered me something I haven't had since before the war. Purpose. A place where my skills would truly matter. And now that Tim is gone, the need remains, doesn't it? This valley still lacks medical care. This land still needs tending." She squared her shoulders, frown. "I accept your proposal, Colonel Mallister. Half interest in the homestead in exchange for my medical expertise and labor." He extended his hand. "Partners, then." "Partners," she agreed, shaking his hand firmly. That night, after Mallister had shown her to Tim's bed behind the partition, insisting he would take the cot by the stove, Grace lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices high and lonesome. The wind whispered through the chinked logs, carrying the scent of sage and pine. She had made her decision. Now she would have to live with it. Dawn arrived with ruthless clarity, stripping away any romantic notions about frontier life. Grace woke to the sound of coughing, deep, racking coughs that spoke of damaged lungs and advancing illness. She found Colonel Mallister bent over the stove, shoulders heaving with the effort to catch his breath. Without a word, she filled a kettle with water, adding dried herbs from her medical bag, horehound and wild cherry bark. When the steam began to rise, she guided him to sit, draping a towel over his head to capture the vapors. "Breathe as deeply as you can," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. Mallister complied, the coughing gradually subsiding as the steam opened his airways. When she finally removed the towel, his face was flushed, but his breathing easier. "First rule of our partnership," Grace said, hanging the kettle away from the heat, "you will follow my medical directives without question." He raised an eyebrow. "That's rather presumptuous for your first day, Miss Whitmore. Would you argue with your commanding officer in battle?" "No, but then don't argue with your physician on matters of health." She poured him a cup of the herbal infusion. "Drink this, all of it." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes, but he obeyed, grimacing at the bitter taste. "You have a commanding presence for someone so—" "Female?" she supplied dryly. "I was going to say newly arrived," he corrected, though they both knew otherwise. "What's our second rule?" "Honesty," Grace said immediately. "I need to know everything about this homestead, its challenges, its resources, its vulnerabilities. No more surprises." Mallister considered this, then nodded once. "Fair enough." He drained the last of the bitter tea. "Get dressed for riding. I'll show you what we're up against." An hour later, they crested a ridge overlooking the entire valley. From this vantage point, Grace could see a dozen scattered homesteads, most little more than crude shacks with small plots of cultivated land. To the north, a much larger property sprawled across prime bottomland, a proper ranch house, multiple outbuildings, and vast cattle pens. "Hargrove's spread," Mallister explained, following her gaze. "General William Hargrove, Confederate Cavalry, now the largest landowner in the county and mayor of Pine Ridge." "You say Confederate like it still matters," Grace observed. Mallister's face hardened. "Out here, the war never quite ended, just changed battlefields." He pointed to a thin silver line cutting through the valley floor. "That's Cottonwood Creek, lifeblood of every homestead in this valley, including ours." "It looks substantial," Grace noted. It was, until Hargrove started damming the northern tributaries for his cattle operation. Mallister turned his horse, leading her along the ridge. "Last summer, the creek ran dry for 3 weeks. We nearly lost everything." "Is that legal?" Water rights in Wyoming follow the doctrine of prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. "And who was first?" A grim smile touched Mallister's lips. "That's the question that's kept this valley on the edge of war for 3 years." They continued riding, Mallister pointing out landmarks and boundaries. The more Grace saw, the more she understood the magnitude of what she'd committed to. The soil was indeed rich in places, but water was clearly the critical issue. Without reliable irrigation, the homestead would fail. "Your brother's letters mentioned a spring on the property," she said as they rode back toward the cabin. "Tim was an optimist," Mallister replied. "There's a seep that runs during spring melt, but nothing year-round." "Then how do you plan to prove up the claim without reliable water?" Mallister reined his horse to a stop, dismounting with careful movements that betrayed his weakened condition. He led her to an outcropping of rock, pushing aside brush to reveal a dark opening, a cave extending into the hillside. Tim discovered this last winter, he explained, taking a lantern from his saddlebag and lighting it. Come see. Grace followed him into the cool darkness, the temperature dropping noticeably as they ventured deeper. The passage narrowed, then opened into a small chamber where the lantern light reflected off a still pool of water. An underground spring, she breathed, understanding dawning. Feeds directly from the mountains, Mallister confirmed, completely independent of Cottonwood Creek. Tim was mapping it when he fell ill. Grace knelt beside the pool, testing the water with her fingers. It was cold and clear. This could change everything. If we can channel it to the surface, Mallister agreed. Tim had plans, but he trailed off, the loss of his brother, momentarily visible in his stoic features. We'll finish what he started, Grace said firmly, rising to her feet. Mallister studied her with a new appreciation. You might actually have the grit for this life, Miss Whitmore. I've sutured wounds under artillery fire, Colonel. A little cave water hardly intimidates me. She brushed past him toward the entrance. Now, I believe I have patients to attend to. Patients? Mallister questioned, following her. We haven't announced your presence yet. Word travels quickly in small communities, Grace replied. And I noticed at least 2 homesteads with children displaying signs of respiratory distress. The smoke from their cook fires was visible for miles. Mallister shook his head in mild disbelief. You observed all that during our ride? I told you, Colonel, observation is essential to medicine. She mounted her horse with practiced ease. And to survival. By mid-afternoon, Grace had visited 3 homesteads, treating 2 children with bronchial infections and an elderly man with an infected leg wound. Word of the new doctor woman spread rapidly, and by the time she returned to the Mallister cabin, 2 more families were waiting. Colonel Mallister watched from the doorway as she worked, efficiently diagnosing ailments and dispensing medicines from her supplies. Her manner was brisk but kind, her instructions clear, even to those with limited English. When she spoke with a Lakota woman about her infant's fever, Mallister's eyebrows rose in surprise. You speak their language? He asked later, as the sun began to set. Only a few phrases, Grace admitted, washing her hands in a basin. I learned from a Lakota scout during the war, enough to establish trust. Trust is hard-earned in these parts, Mallister observed, especially between whites and Indians. Disease doesn't discriminate, Grace replied. Neither should medicine. Before Mallister could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders approached the cabin, their mounts kicking up dust in the fading light. Mallister's posture immediately stiffened, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped beside the door. Hargrove, he muttered, stepping onto the porch. The lead rider was a distinguished man in his 60s, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, despite his age. He wore a black coat over a brocade vest, a gold watch chain gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. The 2 men flanking him were younger, hard-faced, with the watchful eyes of hired guns. Colonel Mallister, the older man called, his deep voice carrying a Virginia accent. I see you've acquired a guest. This is Miss Grace Whitmore, Mallister replied coolly, my new partner in the homestead. General Hargrove removed his hat with theatrical courtesy. William Hargrove, Miss Whitmore, mayor of Pine Ridge and your nearest neighbor of consequence. His smile didn't reach his eyes. When I heard Timothy had passed, I expected this claim might finally be abandoned. The claim is secure, Mallister stated flatly. As you can see, we're actively working the land. Are you indeed? Hargrove's gaze swept dismissively over the modest homestead. Looks to me like you're barely holding on. A dying man and a woman doctor won't last a month when the dry season hits. Grace stepped forward, her expression professionally neutral. We appreciate your concern, General, but I assure you the Mallister homestead will meet all requirements for proving up. Hargrove's attention fixed on her, his assessment coldly calculating. You're a long way from civilization, Miss Whitmore. The frontier breaks most men. It absolutely devours women with progressive ideas. History suggests otherwise, Grace replied evenly. Women have been the backbone of every frontier this country has known. A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, Hargrove replaced his hat. I came to make you an offer, Mallister. One last courtesy for an old acquaintance. He reached into his coat, producing an envelope. $500 for your claim. More than generous, given its condition. Mallister didn't take the envelope. This land isn't for sale. Everything has a price, Hargrove insisted, especially when survival is at stake. Not everything, General. Mallister's voice hardened. Some things are still sacred, even in Wyoming territory. Hargrove's congenial mask slipped, revealing something cold beneath. Stubbornness cost your brother his life, Colonel. Don't let it cost you what little time you have left. He tucked the envelope away. My offer stands until the spring melt. After that, he shrugged eloquently. Well, nature has its own way of settling disputes. With a slight nod to Grace, he wheeled his horse around, his men following as they rode into the gathering darkness. Grace waited until us were out of earshot before speaking. You know each other, beyond territorial disputes. Mallister's face was unreadable in the dusk. We have history. What kind of history makes a man like that visit personally instead of sending his hired guns? For a long moment, Mallister said nothing. Then with a heavy sigh, he retrieved a bottle from inside the cabin and poured 2 small measures of whiskey. Gettysburg, he said, finally, handing her a glass. Second day of fighting. Hargrove led a cavalry charge against our position. His horse was shot out from under him, left leg crushed in the fall. He took a swallow of whiskey. I was the one who dragged him to safety. You saved his life, Grace realized. An enemy officer. In that moment, there were no enemies. Just men dying in a field far from home. Mallister stared into his glass. His son was riding beside him. Boy couldn't have been more than 17. Took a mini-ball to the chest during the retreat. And the son? Died in a field hospital 3 days later. Mallister finished his whiskey in one swift motion. Under my watch. Understanding dawned on Grace's face. You were a field surgeon. Assistant surgeon with the 8th Illinois. Before the cavalry, I studied medicine at Harvard. His laugh was bitter. Ironic, isn't it? You came expecting one Dr. Mallister and found another. Why did you stop practicing? Mallister set down his empty glass, his eyes distant. Some wounds can't be healed, Miss Whitmore. Some failures follow you forever. Before Grace could respond, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Mallister glanced at the darkening sky where storm clouds gathered against the mountains. Rain's coming, he observed, first of the season. As if on cue, fat drops began to fall, pattering against the cabin roof and raising dust from the dry earth. The smell of wet sage filled the air, pungent, cleansing. New beginnings, Grace murmured, raising her face to the rain. Mallister watched her, something unreadable crossing his features. Or omens, he countered quietly. Hard to tell which in this country. As darkness settled completely over the homestead, neither of them noticed the rider watching from the distant ridge, a solitary figure silhouetted against the storm-laden sky, observing with patient malevolence before turning his horse toward the Hargrove ranch. The game had begun. The spring rains transformed the valley. What had been dusty furrows 2 weeks before now showed promising green shoots, stretching toward the sun with stubborn determination. Grace found herself watching the fields each morning, marveling at how quickly life asserted itself when given half a chance. Colonel Mallister's condition had stabilized under her care. A regimen of rest, proper nutrition, and herbal treatments had reduced his coughing fits and improved his stamina. Though still far from healthy, he worked from sunrise to sunset, pushing himself with the grim resolve of a man racing his own mortality. They fell into an efficient partnership. Mornings were devoted to the homestead, tending crops, mending fences, continuing work on the half-finished barn. Afternoons saw Grace riding to neighboring farms, her medical services paid for in eggs, milk, or labor. Colonel Mallister focused on his own project, a system of wooden pipes to channel water from the underground spring to their fields. On this particular morning, Grace knelt in the kitchen garden, transplanting seedlings that had outgrown their starter boxes. The sun beat down on her shoulders, already turning her fair skin a deeper shade despite the wide-brimmed hat she wore. She had abandoned Eastern fashions for practical clothing, divided skirts, cotton blouses, and sturdy boots. The transformation was more than sartorial. Each day on the frontier stripped away another layer of Philadelphia propriety. Miss Whitmore, Mallister's voice carried from the direction of the barn. Riders coming. Grace shaded her eyes, spotting the dust cloud on the horizon. 2 riders approaching at an unhurried pace. Not Hargrove's men then, they always rode hard, as if eager to intimidate. She rose, brushing soil from her hands, as Mallister limped to her side, rifle casually but purposefully held across his body. Expecting trouble? She asked, noting his stance. Always, he replied grimly. Stay behind me. I'm hardly defenseless, Colonel. His eyes flicked to her briefly. Humor me. As the riders drew closer, Grace could make out a man and a boy of perhaps 14. The man wore the distinctive hat of the U.S. Marshals, a silver badge catching the sunlight. The boy was clearly Native American, his long black hair tied back, his clothing a mixture of white and traditional Lakota elements. Marshal Davies, Mallister identified, relaxing slightly, and Running Elk, didn't expect to see them together. He stepped forward as the riders reached the yard, lowering his rifle. "Marshal, what brings you out this way?" Marshal James Davies was a lean, weathered man with a salt and pepper mustache and alert eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. "Colonel Mallister." He tipped his hat to Grace. "Ma'am, James Davies, U.S. Marshal for the territory." "Grace Whitmore," she replied with a polite nod. "Would you care for coffee, Marshal?" "Much obliged." Davies gestured to his companion. "This here's Running Elk. His father is Chief Running Hawk of the Lakota Band up at Pine Ridge Reservation." The boy remained mounted, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the homestead. He wore a U.S. Army Scout's jacket that was too large for his frame, suggesting it had been passed down or bartered for. "What brings a marshal and a Lakota scout to our door?" Mallister asked, leading them toward the cabin porch. Davies accepted a seat on a rough-hewn bench. "Water rights dispute. Hargrove's been damming more tributaries upstream. Reservation's getting half the water they're entitled to under the treaty." Mallister's expression darkened. "He's cutting off our creek, too." "Same story all over the valley," Davies confirmed. "I've been tasked with surveying the waterways, documenting the dams, preparing a federal case." "And the boy?" Grace asked, bringing coffee to the porch. "He knows every inch of these waterways. His people have lived here for generations." Running Elk finally spoke, his English clear but accented. "My father says Hargrove men build new dam where our hunting grounds meet settler lands, many animals gone now, stream dry." Mallister exchanged a glance with Grace. "That's the northwest corner of our property." "Which is why we're here," Davies explained. "We need to survey your land, document the water routes, if you've no objection." "None whatsoever," Grace replied before Mallister could answer. "In fact, we'd like to show you something that might be relevant to your investigation." The colonel raised an eyebrow, but didn't contradict her. "Much obliged, ma'am," Davies said. "We can start whenever you're ready." Mallister drained his coffee. No time like the present. They set out on horseback, Mallister leading the way along the western boundary of the homestead. The land rose gradually toward a series of rocky outcroppings that marked the transition to higher elevation. Grace rode beside Running Elk, noting his expert horsemanship and watchful demeanor. "I treated a woman from your reservation," she mentioned. "Swift deer, her infant had a fever." The boy's eyes flickered with recognition. "My aunt. She said you speak some Lakota words. Not like other white doctors." "Very few," Grace admitted. "I wish I knew more." Running Elk studied her with new interest. "My people say a healer must know the soul of those they treat. Language is the door to the soul." It was a surprisingly philosophical statement from one so young. Before Grace could respond, Mallister called from ahead, gesturing them forward to where the creek bed cut across their property, bone dry despite the recent rains. Davies dismounted, examining the stream bed with practiced eyes. "Water should be flowing here, given the rainfall." He looked up at the surrounding hills. "Hargrove's new dam must be significant." "It's more than just the dam," Mallister said. "Come see what my brother discovered." He led them to the cave entrance, lighting lanterns for the descent. Running Elk hesitated at the threshold, murmuring something in Lakota. "What did he say?" Grace asked quietly. "Places beneath the earth are dwelling places of spirits," Davies translated. "He's asking permission to enter." After a moment of silent prayer, the boy followed them into the darkness. The narrow passage opened to the underground spring, where their lanterns illuminated the still, clear pool. "An aquifer," Davies breathed, clearly impressed, "independent of the surface streams." Running Elk knelt by the water, dipping his fingers and tasting it. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing to markings on the cave wall that Grace hadn't noticed before. "What's he saying?" she asked. "Says his people knew of this place," Davies translated. "These markings are old, generations old. They tell of underground rivers that feed many springs." Mallister examined the markings more closely. "Tim never mentioned these." "Perhaps he never saw them," Grace suggested, "or didn't recognize their significance." Running Elk continued speaking, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. "He says there are many such springs," Davies relayed, "a network beneath the entire valley. His grandfather taught him that they're all connected, flowing from the sacred mountains." "If that's true," Mallister said slowly, Then Hargrove's dams can't control all the water. Not if we can access it underground. Davies nodded. That would certainly change the equation, but you'd need to prove the connection. Show that these aquifers feed multiple properties. Could your federal case include protection for underground water rights? Grace asked. It's complicated territory, legally speaking. Davies rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Water law is still developing out here, but if we could demonstrate that Hargrove is deliberately cutting off established water sources while alternatives exist, he nodded decisively. Yes, that could strengthen the government's position considerably. Running Elk said something else, his tone urgent. He says Hargrove's men have been seen near other cave entrances. Davies translated, frowning. Examining them, sometimes blocking them with rocks. He's trying to cut off every water source, Mallister realized. Surface and underground. Man with many cattle needs much water, Running Elk stated simply. Takes from others without asking. This not the way. They emerged from the cave into bright sunlight, blinking as their eyes adjusted. Grace noticed Mallister's labored breathing from the exertion and made a mental note to prepare his medicine when they returned to the cabin. I'd like to see this new dam, Davies decided. If it's on the boundary between reservation land and your property, it's doubly problematic. It's rough country, Mallister warned. Good 3-hour ride. I've got daylight to burn, the marshal replied. And this is precisely what I was sent to document. Grace glanced at Mallister, concerned about his stamina for such a journey. He caught her look and shook his head slightly, a warning not to mention his condition in front of the others. I'll prepare some food for the journey, she said instead. As she turned toward the cabin, the distant sound of galloping horses reached them. From the eastern approach came 4 riders, pushing their mounts hard. Hargrove's men, Mallister muttered, reaching for his rifle. Easy, Colonel, Davies cautioned, placing a hand on the weapon. Let me handle this. I wear the law on my chest. The riders pulled up short when they spotted the marshal's badge gleaming in the sunlight. Their leader, a hard-faced man with a drooping mustache, addressed Davies directly. Marshal, didn't expect to find you out here. Mr. Reed, Davies nodded coolly. Official business for the U.S. government. Reed's eyes flicked to Running Elk, narrowing with unconcealed disdain. Consorting with savages now, is it? General Hargrove won't take kindly to that. General Hargrove isn't the law in this territory, Davies replied mildly. And Running Elk is officially attached to my investigation as a scout and interpreter. Reed spat into the dust. Investigation into what exactly? Water rights violations. Illegal damming of waterways. Interference with Indian treaty lands. Davies listed the offenses casually, as if reading a grocery list. Would you care to make a statement, Mr. Reed? As General Hargrove's foreman, I mean. The foreman's face darkened. I've got nothing to say to you, Marshal, but I've got plenty to say to Mallister here. He shifted his attention. You're harboring squatters on Hargrove land, Colonel. This is my homestead claim, Mallister replied evenly. Registered and legal. I'm talking about the northwest corner. There's a family of nesters set up in the Cottonwood Grove. Hargrove wants them gone by sundown. Grace stepped forward. That Cottonwood Grove is on Mallister property, not Hargrove's, and we've given no one permission to settle there. Check your survey lines, Lady Doctor, Reed sneered. That grove belongs to the general, and he doesn't tolerate trespassers. Davies intervened. If there's a boundary dispute, it needs to be settled legally, not by force. I'll ride out there myself to assess the situation. You do that, Marshal. Reed gathered his reins, but the general's patience has limits. He nodded to his men and they wheeled their horses, galloping away in a cloud of dust. Friendly bunch, Grace observed dryly. Hargrove breeds loyalty through fear, Mallister replied. Reed's been his attack dog for years. Davies watched the retreating riders thoughtfully. This changes things. We need to check on these settlers first. Make sure they're not in immediate danger. I'll come with you, Grace decided, ignoring Mallister's disapproving look. If there are women and children, they might need medical attention. And I need to see exactly where this disputed boundary lies, Mallister added. Tim's survey markers should still be visible. They set out after a brief stop at the cabin for supplies. The ride to the northwest corner took nearly an hour. The terrain becoming increasingly wooded as they approached the Cottonwood Grove. A small creek, now reduced to a trickle, wound through the trees, its banks lush with undergrowth. The settler's cabin came into view as they entered the grove, a crude affair of logs and canvas, obviously constructed in haste. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and a small garden had been scratched out of the earth nearby. Hello, the house, Davies called. keeping his hands visible as they approached. The cabin door opened cautiously, revealing a bearded man with a shotgun held across his body, a mirror of Mallister's earlier stance. Behind him hovered a woman and two small children, their faces pinched with worry. "Who's asking?" the settler demanded. "U.S. Marshal Davies," the lawman replied. "And neighbors. We mean no harm." The man lowered his shotgun slightly but remained wary. "Jacob Muller, this is my wife Hannah and our children." Grace noted the German accent, the threadbare quality of their clothing, the fearful eyes of the children. Immigrants recently arrived and desperate for a foothold in the new country. "Mr. Muller," Mallister addressed him directly, "there seems to be some confusion about this land." "No confusion," Muller insisted. "We have papers. Homestead claim, 160 acres filed in Cheyenne last month." "May I see these papers?" Davies asked. Muller hesitated, then nodded to his wife, who disappeared inside the cabin. She returned with a folded document, which she handed to her husband. He passed it to Davies. The marshal examined it carefully, his expression growing troubled. "This claim was filed, but—" He glanced up at Mallister. "According to these coordinates, they're squarely within your registered homestead, Colonel. The boundaries overlap significantly." "That's impossible," Muller protested. "Land Office said it was open for claim." Running Elk, who had been examining the surroundings, spoke up. Boundary stake moved. He pointed to a weathered wooden post half hidden in tall grass. "Should be there." He indicated a spot nearly 50 yards away. "Someone move it." Davies dismounted to examine the stake. "He's right, this has been recently repositioned." He brushed dirt from the base. "The original hole is still visible over there." Mallister's face darkened with understanding. "Hargrove, he altered the survey markers to create this conflict." "But why?" Grace asked. "What does he gain by having two homesteaders fighting over the same parcel?" "Divide and conquer," Davies said grimly. "If you're fighting each other, you're not uniting against him." Classic tactic. Muller's wife stepped forward, her accent thicker than her husband's. "What happens now? We sold everything to come here. If we lose this claim—" "You won't," Grace assured her. "There's been deception here, but not on your part." "The law's clear," Davies added. "Colonel Mallister's claim predates yours, Mr. Muller. Legally, this land belongs to his homestead." The German's shoulders slumped in defeat. Hannah began to weep quietly, gathering her children close. Mallister watched them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he sighed heavily. "There's another option." He turned to Grace. "The southeast corner of our claim, the rocky parcel where the soil's too poor for farming. It meets the legal requirements for a homestead, but isn't critical to our operation." Grace understood immediately. "We could relinquish that portion of our claim." "File an adjustment with the Land Office," Mallister confirmed. "The Mullers could refile their claim on that parcel." Davies nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible, unusual but legal." "But that land is not good for farming?" Muller questioned, hope warring with practicality. "It's not ideal for crops," Mallister admitted, "but it has other advantages. It's defensible, has a natural spring, good grazing for a few cattle or goats." He glanced at Grace. "And it's within easy reach of medical care, should your family need it." Hannah clutched her husband's arm. "Jacob, please, we have nowhere else." Muller studied Mallister with cautious hope. "Why would you do this? Give up part of your claim to strangers?" "Because I know what it means to start over," Mallister replied simply, "and because spite makes for poor neighboring." The tension drained from Muller's posture. "Then I accept, with gratitude." "Don't thank me yet," Mallister cautioned. "We still have Hargrove to deal with, and he won't be pleased by this solution." Davies remounted his horse. "First things first. We need to properly mark these boundaries and document the tampering. Then I'll escort the Mullers to our original destination. I want to see this dam for myself." "What about your cabin?" Grace asked the settlers. "Will you rebuild on the new parcel?" "Too dangerous to stay here now," Hannah replied, glancing nervously at the surrounding woods. "Those men, they threatened Jacob this morning, said they'd return at sundown." "Then you'll come back with us," Grace decided. "Stay at our cabin until it's safe to establish your new homestead." "We couldn't impose," Muller began. "It's not an imposition," Mallister cut him off. "It's frontier common sense, safety in numbers." With the matter decided, they helped the Mullers gather their essential belongings. The children, initially frightened, warmed to Grace when she produced hard candies from her medical bag. Running Elk showed the older boy how to identify deer tracks in the soft earth by the creek, the language barrier falling away in the face of shared knowledge. As they prepared to depart, Davies drew Mallister aside. This is escalating faster than I anticipated. Hargrove is making aggressive moves. He's always been impatient, Mallister replied. It's why he lost so many men at Gettysburg. Couldn't wait for proper reconnaissance. You knew him during the war? I knew him before it, Mallister corrected. We grew up on neighboring plantations in Virginia, attended the same military academy, chose different sides when the time came. His expression grew distant. Some wounds never heal, Marshal. This feels personal, Davies observed. With Hargrove, everything is personal. Mallister checked his pocket watch. We should move out. I want to reach the dam and return home before sundown. They traveled in a small caravan, the Muller family in their wagon, the others on horseback. The terrain grew steadily more rugged as they approached the reservation boundary. Grace rode beside Hannah's wagon, noting with professional concern the woman's pallor and the persistent cough of her youngest child. How long has your son been ill? She asked. Since Denver, Hannah replied. Doctor there said lungs not good, too much coal smoke in city. She looked anxiously at the boy. Will Frontier Air help him? Clean air is beneficial, Grace confirmed, but I'd like to examine him properly when we reach the cabin. I have medicines that might ease his breathing. Hannah's eyes filled with grateful tears. God sent you to us, I think. I'm just a nurse doing her job, Grace demurred, though out here that apparently makes me a doctor. You are doctor, the German woman insisted, not just nurse. I see how you look at my son with knowledge in your eyes. Before Grace could respond, Running Elk galloped back from his scouting position ahead, speaking rapidly to Davies and Lakota. The marshal's expression grew grim. Problem, Mallister called. Hargrove's men, Davies replied. At least a dozen at the dam site. Running Elk says they're armed and looking for trouble. We should turn back, Grace suggested, glancing at the Mueller children. Can't. Running Elk pointed to the darkening sky. Storm coming, fast and big. He was right. While they'd been focused on their journey, thunderheads had built over the mountains, massive and threatening. Already the wind was picking up, carrying the electric scent of imminent rain. There's a line shack near the dam, Mallister said, used by shepherders in summer months. If we can reach it before the storm breaks. And Hargrove's men? Davies asked. They won't expect us to ride directly toward them, Mallister reasoned, especially in a storm. Element of surprise may work in our favor. Muller spoke up from the wagon. I have fought in Franco-Prussian War. I can handle rifle if needed. Davies made his decision. We push forward. Stay tight. Keep the wagon in the middle. If there's trouble, protection of the women and children comes first. They continued up the narrowing trail, the wind growing stronger with each passing minute. Ahead, the landscape opened into a small valley, bisected by what should have been a substantial creek. Instead, a massive earthen dam blocked the waterway, creating a pond on the upstream side while leaving the downstream portion completely dry. From their elevated position, they could see Hargrove's men gathered near the dam, some on horseback, others working with shovels to reinforce the structure. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed seconds later by a powerful thunderclap that made the horses dance nervously. The shack's just beyond that ridge, Mallister pointed. If we skirt the edge of the valley, stay in the tree line. His planning was interrupted by a shout from below. One of Hargrove's men had spotted them, pointing up at their position on the hillside. So much for surprise, Davies muttered, his hand moving to his sidearm. Change of plans. Muller, get your family to that shack as fast as your wagon can manage. Running Elk, guide them. The rest of us will create a diversion. Grace watched with alarm as Reed and several armed men mounted their horses and started up the hillside toward them. What kind of diversion did you have in mind, Marshal? Davies drew his revolver. The official kind. I'm still a U.S. Marshal and they're still trespassing on reservation land. With grim resolve, he urged his horse forward, directly toward the approaching riders. Mallister hesitated only a moment before following, rifle at the ready. Men, U.S. Marshal, stand down immediately! Davies' voice carried across the valley, authority ringing in every syllable. Reed and his men pulled up short, clearly not expecting a federal officer. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and fat raindrops began to fall, splattering in the dust. Grace made a split-second decision. Rather than following Muller's wagon, she spurred her horse after Mallister and Davies. If this confrontation turned violent, her medical skills would be needed. She reached them just as Davies and Reed were facing off, the atmosphere as charged as the storm around them. This is reservation land, Davies was saying. That dam is in direct violation of treaty rights. We have proper permits, Reed countered, signed by Judge Wallace himself. Wallace has no jurisdiction over Indian treaty lands, Davies retorted, and you know it. Reed's gaze shifted to Mallister. This isn't about the dam, is it, Marshal? It's about the colonel here filling your head with lies. Him and his savage friends. Careful, Reed, Mallister warned. Your prejudice is showing. The foreman's hand drifted toward his holster. General Hargrove warned you, Mallister. This valley ain't big enough for both of you. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Davies observed coolly. Care to rephrase while you're speaking to a federal officer? The standoff might have escalated further, but nature intervened. A blinding flash of lightning struck a tree not 50 yards away, the explosive crack of thunder instantaneous. Spooked horses reared and bucked, throwing several of Reed's men to the ground. Rain began to pour in earnest, turning the dusty hillside treacherous within seconds. "This isn't finished," Reed shouted over the storm, struggling to control his mount. "Tell Hargrove we'll settle this another day," Davies called back. "Legally." Reed and his remaining men retreated down the hillside, fighting both the terrain and the worsening weather. Davies turned to Grace and Mallister, rain streaming down his face. "We need shelter, now!" They battled their way along the ridge, the world reduced to sheets of rain and periodic flashes of lightning. Grace lost all sense of direction, trusting her horse to follow Mallister's through the deluge. Her soaked clothing clung to her body, the cold penetrating to her bones despite the summer air. After what seemed an eternity, a dark shape materialized before them. The line shack. Mueller's wagon was already there, the family huddled inside with running elk. They dismounted, securing the horses beneath a crude lean-to before rushing into the single-room structure. The interior was basic but dry. A dirt floor, rough plank walls, a small stone fireplace. Running elk had already started a fire, the welcome warmth drawing them like moths to flame. Grace immediately went to the Muller children, checking for signs of hypothermia. The younger boy's cough had worsened. His breathing labored. She dug through her sodden medical bag, relieved to find her medicines still dry in their oilskin wrapping. "Here," she said, measuring powder into a cup of water. "This will ease his breathing." Hannah accepted it gratefully, helping her son drink the bitter mixture. "Thank you, doctor." Mallister shrugged out of his wet coat, hanging it near the fire. His face was pale, lips tinged slightly blue, warning signs Grace recognized immediately. "You need to warm up," she said quietly, guiding him closer to the hearth. "And take your medicine." For once, he didn't argue, accepting the tincture she pressed into his hand. His fingers were ice cold despite the summer heat, another troubling symptom. Davies and Mueller worked to reinforce the door against the howling wind, while running elk tended the horses. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, lightning striking repeatedly across the valley. "Will the dam hold?" Grace asked, thinking of the massive earthwork they'd seen. "Depends how well it was built," Mallister replied between sips of medicine. "Hargrove doesn't usually cut corners on construction." Davies joined them by the fire. "If it fails, the flood could wipe out everything downstream." A particularly violent thunderclap shook the cabin, making them all jump. Hannah clutched her children closer, murmuring prayers in German. "The Lakotas say storms like this are the Sky Father's anger," Running Elk commented, returning from the lean-to, "when humans take more than their share." As if in response to his words, a sound rose above the storm, a deep, groaning crack followed by a distant roar. Davies rushed to the door, forcing it open against the wind to peer outside. "The dam!" he shouted. "It's giving way!" They crowded around him, watching in awe and terror as the massive earthen structure collapsed. A wall of water surged down the valley, carrying debris and uprooted trees in its unstoppable path. "Sweet Jesus," Mallister breathed, "the homesteads downstream." "Including ours," Grace realized with dawning horror. "Colonel, our cabin is directly in the flood path." As they watched the destruction unfold, a horseman appeared on the ridge across the valley, a solitary figure silhouetted against the storm-racked sky. Even at this distance, the military bearing was unmistakable. "Hargrove," Mallister identified grimly, "come to witness his handiwork." "Or the unintended consequences of it," Davies amended. The distant figure raised a hand, not in greeting but in what appeared to be a salute, a soldier's acknowledgement of a battle joined. Then he wheeled his horse and disappeared into the curtain of rain. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Grace asked, a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes settling into her bones. "No, Miss Whitmore," Mallister replied, his eyes fixed on the point where Hargrove had vanished. "This is the continuation of a war that never truly ended. And now you're caught in the crossfire. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the floodwaters raging toward their homestead, carrying with it everything they had built. In that moment, Grace understood that their struggle had escalated beyond a simple land dispute. This was now a battle for survival against both nature and human malevolence. And somewhere in the storm, General William Hargrove was planning his next move. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. The flood had carved a new path through the valley, leaving behind a swath of mud, uprooted trees, and scattered debris. From the ridge where they had spent the night, Grace surveyed the devastation with a heavy heart. "Can you see the cabin?" Hannah Mueller asked, joining her at the edge of the bluff. Grace shaded her eyes against the rising sun. "It's still standing," she confirmed with relief. "Damaged, but standing." Colonel Mallister approached, his face drawn from a night spent fighting his cough. The storm had worsened his condition, forcing Grace to keep vigil through the darkest hours. Now, in the harsh morning light, she could see the toll it had taken. "Marshal Davies and Running Elk are checking the trail down," he reported. "Should be passable by midday." "And the other homesteads?" Grace asked. Mallister's expression tightened. "Some fared better than others. Muller's cabin at the Cottonwood Grove is gone completely." Hannah crossed herself. "Thanks be to God we were not there." "God had little to do with it," Mallister muttered. "This was Hargrove's doing, intentional or otherwise." Grace touched his arm lightly, a silent reminder to temper his bitterness in front of the frightened woman. Mallister acknowledged her warning with a curt nod. "We should prepare to move out," he said instead. "The Mullers can stay with us until they can rebuild on the southeast parcel." As they returned to the line shack, Marshal Davies rode up, his horse mud spattered to the flanks. "Trail's clear enough for careful travel," he announced, "but there's something you should see first." He led them to the edge of the bluff overlooking the dam site. Where yesterday a massive earthwork had stood, now only scattered remnants remained. The force of the water had obliterated Hargrove's construction, carving a deeper channel through the original creek bed. "Nature reclaimed what was hers," Running Elk observed quietly. "Yes, but at what cost?" Davies gestured to the devastated valley below. "At least 3 homesteads destroyed that I could see. Livestock drowned, crops washed away." "Will Hargrove be held accountable?" Grace asked. The marshal's expression was grim. "Legally? Doubtful. He'll claim it was an act of God, not negligence." "It was neither," Mallister stated flatly. "That dam was built to fail." Davies raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation, Colonel." "I know Hargrove. I know how he thinks." Mallister pointed to where the dam had stood. "The placement wasn't random. It was calculated to maximize damage downstream while preserving his own property. Look at the channel. It curves away from Hargrove land and directly toward the homesteader claims." Running Elk nodded slowly. "Water follows path made for it, like horse follows trail." "You're suggesting he deliberately engineered a flood to destroy his competition," Davies said skeptically. "I'm stating it as fact," Mallister replied. "This is warfare, Marshal, Hargrove style." The journey back to the homestead was slow and arduous. The wagon struggled through mud that sometimes reached the axles, requiring all hands to push it free. By mid-afternoon, they crested the final rise that overlooked the Mallister property. The cabin had indeed survived, though one wall showed significant damage. The newly planted fields were completely submerged, weeks of labor erased in a single night. The half-finished barn had collapsed entirely, its timbers scattered like matchsticks. "Oh, Colonel," Grace murmured, seeing the devastation of their work. Mallister's face remained stoic, betraying nothing. "We'll rebuild," he said simply. "We've survived worse." As they approached the cabin, a figure emerged from inside. A woman in a plain dress, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried a broom and wore an expression that suggested she'd been expecting them. "Martha Jenkins," Mallister identified, surprise evident in his voice. "Shopkeeper's widow from Pine Ridge." Mrs. Jenkins propped her broom against the porch and crossed her arms. "Took you long enough, Everett Mallister. I've been cleaning mud out of your cabin since dawn." "How did you know?" he began. "Word travels fast when half the valley floods," she interrupted. "My boys and I came to help. They're out salvaging your barn lumber." She turned her attention to Grace. "You must be the doctor woman everyone's talking about." "Nurse," Grace corrected, automatically dismounting. "Grace Whitmore." "Nurse doctor. Out here it's all the same. You heal, that's what matters." Mrs. Jenkins noticed the Muellers in their wagon. "More flood victims?" "Neighbors," Grace explained. "Their cabin was destroyed." The older woman nodded briskly. Well, bring them in. I've got stew on the stove and beds made up. Mallister looked bemused by the takeover of his home. Martha always was a force of nature. A welcome one, it seems, Grace replied, helping Hannah down from the wagon. We could use some good fortune. Inside, the cabin showed signs of the flood, water stains marking the walls nearly 2 feet high. But Mrs. Jenkins had worked small miracles. The floor was swept clean, furniture rotted and dried, bedding hung by the fire to remove dampness. The smell of beef stew filled the small space, making Grace suddenly aware of her hunger. My sons found 3 of your chickens, Mrs. Jenkins reported as she ladled stew into bowls. The cow turned up at the Peterson place, half a mile downstream. They were bringing her back tomorrow. Why are you helping us, Mrs. Jenkins? Grace asked when they were all seated around the table. The older woman's eyes crinkled. Because 30 years ago, when I first came to this territory, someone did the same for me. That's how we survive out here, by remembering to be human when the land tries to make us animals. After the meal, Marshal Davies prepared to depart. I need to file my report on the dam failure. The federal government won't take kindly to tampering with reservation water rights. Will it make any difference? Mallister asked skeptically. Perhaps not immediately, Davies admitted, but documentation builds a case. Eventually, Hargrove will overstep in ways even his friends in the territorial government can't ignore. We may not have eventually, Mallister countered. He's escalating his tactics. Then document everything, the marshal advised. Every incursion, every threat. I'll return in 2 weeks' time. He hesitated. In the meantime, I'd advise keeping your rifle close, Colonel. After Davies departed with Running Elk, who was returning to the reservation, Mrs. Jenkins organized them into work parties. Her sons, strapping young men in their 20s, had already salvaged most of the usable lumber from the barn. Muller proved skilled with carpentry tools, while his wife tackled the domestic chaos with Germanic efficiency. Grace found herself working alongside Mallister to drain the flooded fields, digging channels to direct water back to the creek bed. The physical labor was exhausting but necessary. If they couldn't salvage some portion of their crops, winter would be even more challenging than anticipated. You're pushing yourself too hard, she observed as Mallister paused, fighting for breath. No choice, he replied tersely. Every day counts now. Your health counts too. She pressed a handkerchief into his palm as he began coughing. You won't help anyone by collapsing. The handkerchief came away speckled with blood, a worrying sign. Mallister quickly folded it, avoiding her clinical gaze. I'm fine, he insisted. You're not, she countered, and pretending otherwise wastes energy we can't afford to lose. He straightened, a flash of anger crossing his features. What would you have me do, Miss Whitmore? Lie in bed while Hargrove destroys everything my brother built, everything we're trying to save? I'd have you be smart about your limitations, Grace replied evenly. Work smarter, not harder. Delegate, rest when needed. There's no time for rest. There's no time for a burial either, but that's where you're headed if you continue this way. The blunt assessment silenced him. After a moment, he nodded reluctantly. 2 hours of work, 1 hour of rest, he proposed. Will that satisfy your medical concerns? It's a start, Grace conceded, along with proper nutrition and your medications. They returned to their labor, but Grace noticed Mallister was more measured in his efforts afterward. It was a small victory, but out here, small victories were often the only kind available. The next week passed in a blur of rebuilding. Word of their plight spread through the valley, bringing unexpected assistance. Homesteaders who had been spared the worst of the flood contributed what they could: labor, supplies, food. Even 2 Lakota families from the reservation arrived with herbs for Grace's medical supplies and knowledge of how to salvage water-damaged crops. I don't understand, Grace confessed to Mallister as they watched a group of men raising the barn frame. These people barely know us. They're not helping us, he explained. They're helping themselves. Every homestead that survives strengthens their own position against Hargrove. Unity through necessity. By the end of the week, the Mueller family had relocated to the southeast parcel, establishing the beginnings of their new homestead with a sturdy tent and the promise of a cabin soon to follow. Their youngest son was responding well to Grace's treatments, his breathing easier in the higher elevation away from the valley floor. Life was beginning to establish a new rhythm when Judge Wallace arrived. He came without warning, his buggy pulling up to the cabin on a bright morning as Grace tended her salvaged herb garden. The judge was a corpulent man whose expensive suit strained against his girth, his jowly face perpetually flushed from exertion or whiskey. Perhaps both. Miss Whitmore, he wheezed, struggling down from his buggy. Is Colonel Mallister available? He's working at the dam site, Grace replied, wiping her hands on her apron. May I help you, Judge Wallace? This is official business, he declared, producing a document from his breast pocket. Perhaps you'd better fetch him. Something in the judge's tone raised Grace's suspicions. What kind of official business? Wallace's small eyes narrowed. Legal matters concerning this homestead claim. Now, if you'd be so kind, I'll take that, Grace said, extending her hand for the document. As half owner of this homestead, I'm legally entitled to receive any official communications. The judge hesitated, clearly taken aback. Half owner? I was unaware of any change in the claim registration. Filed 2 weeks ago, Grace informed him. Properly recorded at the land office in Cheyenne. I have copies inside if you'd care to review them. Wallace's complexion darkened further. That won't be necessary, but this matter concerns alleged irregularities in the original claim filing. Colonel Mallister's presence is required. Then I'll send for him, Grace conceded, signaling to young Peter Muller, who had been helping with the garden. In the meantime, won't you come inside for refreshments? The ride from Pine Ridge must have been tiring. She led the reluctant judge into the cabin, noting with satisfaction his surprise at the orderly, well-maintained interior. Mrs. Jenkins had returned to town days ago, but her influence remained in the freshly whitewashed walls and polished furniture. Coffee? Grace offered. Whiskey, if you have it, Wallace replied, mopping his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. I'm afraid we don't, she lied smoothly, knowing full well that Mallister kept a bottle for medicinal purposes. Coffee will have to suffice. As she prepared the pot, she studied Wallace from the corner of her eye. His discomfort was evident, not just physical but moral. A man on an errand he found distasteful. How long have you served as judge in these parts? She inquired conversationally. 15 years, he replied, since territorial status was established. A position of considerable influence and considerable responsibility. Wallace shifted in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. The law must be upheld, particularly in frontier regions where men might otherwise resort to violence. Indeed, Grace agreed, like the violence of deliberately sabotaged dams flooding innocent homesteaders. The judge's face reddened. I'm not here to discuss General Hargrove's water management practices. Aren't you? I rather thought that's precisely why you've come. She placed a cup of coffee before him with deliberate care. Tell me, Judge Wallace, how much influence does a territorial judgeship carry when federal authorities become involved in water rights violations? Wallace's hand froze halfway to the cup. What federal authorities? U.S. Marshal Davies has been documenting the dam failures and their impact on reservation lands. I believe he mentioned sending reports to Washington. The judge's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. Marshal Davies is overstepping his jurisdiction. Perhaps, Grace allowed. Or perhaps he's the only one properly exercising it. I understand Indian treaty lands fall under federal, not territorial purview. Before Wallace could respond, the door opened to admit Mallister, his expression darkening at the sight of their visitor. Judge, he acknowledged coolly, to what do we owe this pleasure? Wallace set down his untouched coffee. Colonel, I've brought official notice of a challenge to your homestead claim. He extended the document. General Hargrove has filed a petition alleging that your brother's original survey was fraudulent, encroaching on his existing property lines. Mallister accepted the paper, scanning its contents with a face that betrayed nothing. Convenient timing, he observed. Just after we've invested weeks rebuilding from a flood caused by his dam. The timing is irrelevant to the legal question, Wallace replied stiffly. A survey team will verify the boundaries next week. Until then, all improvements to the property must cease. And if we refuse, Grace challenged, then you risk forfeiture of the entire claim, the judge stated. The law is clear on this matter. Mallister folded the document deliberately. Is it? I wonder, Wallace, if the law is equally clear on judicial corruption, on judges who accept bribes to rule in favor of wealthy landowners. The judge's face mottled with anger. That's a slanderous accusation. Is it? I have Tim's journals. Every meeting, every suspicious ruling, meticulously documented. Mallister's voice remained calm, but his eyes held steel. My brother may have been dying, but his mind remained sharp to the end. Wallace's bluster deflated visibly. You can prove nothing. Perhaps not in your courtroom, Mallister conceded, but in the court of public opinion or in a federal investigation. Tim sent copies of his documentation to friends in Washington, former comrades who now hold significant positions. The threat hung in the air. unspoken but unmistakable. Wallace gathered his dignity, rising from the chair with as much authority as he could muster. "The survey will proceed as scheduled," he declared. "What happens afterward depends on its findings. And those findings will depend on the integrity of the surveyors," Grace added pointedly, "which we'll be monitoring quite closely." After Wallace departed, visibly shaken, Grace turned to Mallister. "Tim really kept such journals?" "Of course," he confirmed. "My brother was meticulous about documentation. But whether they contain what I implied," he shrugged slightly. "Wallace's reaction tells us all we need to know." "You bluffed," Grace realized, impressed. "I calculated odds," Mallister corrected, a skill any field surgeon learns quickly. Grace studied the document Wallace had left. "This boundary challenge, is there any merit to it?" "None whatsoever. Tim's survey was painstakingly accurate, but that won't stop Hargrove from manufacturing evidence." Mallister sank into a chair, suddenly looking every year of his age. "This is just his opening move. He's testing our defenses." "Then we need allies," Grace decided, "more than just scattered homesteaders." "What did you have in mind?" "The reservation," she replied. "Running Elk said his people have suffered from Hargrove's water theft for years. Their treaty rights give them standing with the federal government that we lack as individual homesteaders." Mallister considered this. "An alliance with the Lakota would infuriate Hargrove. He fought against them in the Plains Wars." "Precisely," Grace nodded. "And it would force the territorial government to proceed carefully. They can ignore homesteaders, but not treaty violations that might bring federal troops." "Yeah, but not treaty." A reluctant smile touched Mallister's lips. "You have a tactical mind, Miss Whitmore. The Union Army missed a potential strategist." "I learned from watching generals make mistakes with other people's lives," she replied tartly. "Now, shall we visit the reservation tomorrow, or would you prefer to wait for Hargrove's next move?" "Tomorrow," he decided, "but there's something you should know first." His expression grew serious. "About Hargrove and me, about what really happened at Gettysburg." Grace settled into the chair opposite him, sensing they had reached a crucial juncture. "I'm listening." Mallister stared into the cold fireplace, seeing something far beyond the cabin walls. "I told you I saved Hargrove's life during the battle. What I didn't tell you was why." "Does it matter?" "Saving a life needs no justification. It does when that life was once as close as a brother's." He met her gaze directly. "William Hargrove and I grew up together in Virginia. Our families' plantations adjoined. We were inseparable as boys, attended West Point in the same class. He was best man at my wedding." Grace tried to reconcile this information with the bitter enemies she now knew. What changed? Everything. The war, political differences that became moral divides. "I couldn't support secession or slavery. He couldn't abandon Virginia." Mallister's voice grew distant. "When the time came to choose sides, we made different choices, but we promised never to raise arms directly against each other. And at Gettysburg, I recognized him leading the cavalry charge. That ramrod posture is unmistakable even at a distance. When his horse was shot and he went down, I couldn't—" He paused, composing himself. "I couldn't let him die, regardless of the uniform he wore." "That speaks to your character, not your weakness," Grace observed gently. "Perhaps, but there's more." Mallister's hands clenched on the armrests. His son, William Jr., was riding as his aide, 17 years old, fresh from Virginia Military Institute. When I pulled Hargrove to safety, the boy covered our retreat, taking a bullet meant for his father. Understanding dawned on Grace's face. "And he died in the field hospital, under your care." Mallister nodded once, the movement barely perceptible. "I couldn't save him. Infection set in, and we had no antibiotics, no proper surgical tools. He died in agony, calling for his mother." "You did everything possible," Grace said, recognizing the physician's guilt that never fully faded. "Hargrove doesn't see it that way. In his mind, I saved him but let his son die, a calculated cruelty he can never forgive." Mallister's voice hardened. "He believes I chose my side over his blood. And in his world, blood demands blood in return." "That's why he's so determined to destroy your homestead," Grace realized. "It's not about land or water at all. It's about completing what began at Gettysburg," Mallister confirmed. "A vendetta 27 years in the making." Grace absorbed this revelation, understanding at last the personal stakes underlying their conflict. "Does knowing this change our approach?" "It should," Mallister replied. "Hargrove isn't just a greedy landowner. He's a man consumed by personal vengeance. That makes him more dangerous, but also more vulnerable." His hatred clouds his judgment. Then we use that, Grace decided, her nurse's pragmatism asserting itself. Every weakness can be leveraged for healing or for strategy. Mallister regarded her with new appreciation. You continually surprise me, Miss Whitmore. Good, and she replied simply. Surprise is an advantage in any conflict. The conversation might have continued, but a commotion outside drew their attention. Shouts and the sound of galloping horses broke the afternoon quiet. Grace reached the door first, throwing it open to find 3 riders approaching at speed, Muller and 2 men she didn't recognize, all bearing expressions of grave urgency. Doctor! Muller called, reining his horse to a stop. Come quickly! It's Hannah and the children. Grace's medical instincts immediately sharpened. What's happened? Men came, Hargrove's men, Muller gasped, his accent thickening with distress. They said we trespass. Destroy our tent. Hannah tried to stop them. They hurt her. How badly? Grace demanded, already gathering her medical bag. She bleeds from head. Children screaming. Muller's hands shook on the reins. Please hurry. Grace turned to Mallister, who had already retrieved his rifle. We'll take the wagon, he decided, faster than saddling horses. As they hurried to prepare, one of the unknown riders addressed Mallister. Colonel, there's more. They didn't just attack the Mullers. They're going farm to farm, driving people out, saying all the land reverts to Hargrove after the flood damage. Under whose authority? Mallister demanded. Judge Wallace signed eviction notices, the man replied. Says the homesteads are abandoned after the flood. Grace and Mallister exchanged grim looks, understanding dawning simultaneously. Wallace's visit hadn't been the opening move. It had been a diversion. While they focused on the boundary challenge, Hargrove had launched his real attack elsewhere. He's making his play for the entire valley, Mallister realized, and we've been outflanked. They reached the Muller homestead to find devastation. The family's tent lay in tatters, their meager possessions scattered across the ground. Hannah sat on an overturned crate, pressing a bloodied cloth to her temple while trying to comfort her sobbing children. Grace was out of the wagon before it fully stopped, medical bag in hand. Let me see, she instructed gently, removing the cloth to reveal a 3-inch gash along Hannah's hairline. You'll need stitches, but head wounds always bleed dramatically. It looks worse than it is. As Grace cleaned and sutured the wound, Mallister surveyed the destruction with a soldier's eye. Boot prints in the soft earth told of at least 6 men. Cigarette butts bearing a distinctive Turkish tobacco, Reed's preferred brand, confirmed Hargrove's involvement. Most tellingly, a notice had been nailed to a nearby tree. Abandoned claim, property of Hargrove Land and Cattle Company by order of territorial court. How many men? He asked Muller. 5, maybe 6, the German replied, his hands clenching and unclenching helplessly. They had papers, said this land never properly filed. That's a lie, Mallister stated flatly. I witnessed your filing myself. They say flood cancels claim. Say all damaged homesteads now belong to Hargrove. Muller's eyes flashed with uncharacteristic anger. I fought them. They hit Hannah when she tried to save our things. One of the riders who had accompanied Muller, a lean, sunburnt man, Mallister now recognized as Peterson from the neighboring homestead, spoke up. They're doing the same all over the valley, Colonel. Any place hit by the flood. Got a wagon with them, collecting folks' valuables as salvage fees. Where were they headed next? Mallister demanded. Northeast Properties, Peterson replied, working their way around the valley. Figure they'll hit every place by sundown. Grace finished tying off her last suture, applying a clean bandage to Hannah's head. We need to get these children to shelter, she said, and alert the other homesteaders. Mallister nodded grimly. Peterson, ride to the Lakota camp. Find Running Elk. Tell him what's happening and that we need to speak with Chief Running Hawk immediately. He turned to the other rider. Taylor, warn the Southwest homesteads. Tell them to gather at our place by nightfall. The men nodded and spurred their horses away. Mallister helped Muller gather what remained of his family's possessions, while Grace attended to the children, the younger boy's cough having worsened from stress and exposure. You'll stay with us until this is resolved, Mallister told the German. All of you. Muller's face was a battlefield of pride and necessity. We are burdened to you already. Your neighbors, Mallister corrected, and out here that means something. They loaded the family and their salvaged belongings into the wagon. As Mallister took up the reins, Grace placed a hand on his arm. We need a plan, she said quietly. We can't just react to Hargrove's moves anymore. I know. His eyes were distant, calculating. And I think I have one, but you're not going to like it. By nightfall, the Mallister cabin had become a war council. 23 adults representing 15 homesteads crowded the small space, their faces grim with shared purpose. Outside, children played under the watchful eyes of the older women, momentarily distracted from the crisis that had disrupted their lives. They hit the Johanssons' place around noon, a grizzled Norwegian reported, took their plow horses, said it was payment for trespassing on Hargrove land. Same at the Wilsons, another added, except they burned the cabin when Tom tried to stop them. Each report painted a clearer picture of Hargrove's strategy, systematic intimidation backed by fraudulent legal documents. Judge Wallace had provided a veneer of legitimacy to what amounted to armed robbery. "What about the marshal?" someone asked. "Can't he stop this?" "Davies won't be back for days," Mallister replied, "and by then it could be too late." "So what do we do?" Peterson demanded. "Fight back? Some of us are war veterans, but we're outnumbered and outgunned." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Mallister. Despite his illness and the fact that many present had only known him a short time, they looked to him for leadership, the instinctive deference given to a natural commander. Before he could respond, the door opened to admit Running Elk, accompanied by an older Lakota man whose dignified bearing marked him as someone of importance. Though he wore a mixture of traditional clothing and adopted white garments, there was no mistaking the authority he carried. "Chief Running Hawk," Mallister acknowledged, rising to greet him. The chief nodded once, his weathered face impassive. "Colonel Mallister, my son says your people face the same enemy as mine." "We do," Mallister confirmed. "Hargrove is seizing land throughout the valley, land that rightfully belongs to these families, just as the diverted water rightfully belongs to your people." Running Hawk surveyed the room, taking in the diverse faces, Norwegian, German, Irish, American, united by common threat. "For many years, white men fight each other over land that once belonged to Lakota," he observed. "Now you ask for Lakota help to keep this land." A few homesteaders shifted uncomfortably, the irony not lost on them. "We're not asking you to fight our battles," Grace interjected, stepping forward. "We're proposing an alliance. Hargrove threatens both our communities. Together we might have the strength to stop him." The chief's dark eyes assessed her carefully. "The healing woman. My people speak of your respect for our ways." "I respect knowledge wherever I find it," Grace replied simply. "And I recognize injustice when I see it, whether against your people or these families." Running Hawk seemed to come to a decision. "What alliance do you propose?" Mallister outlined his plan, a bold strategy that drew murmurs of both approval and apprehension from the assembled homesteaders. When he finished, the room erupted in debate. "It's too risky," one man objected. "It's our only chance," another countered. "What about our families if it fails?" Running Hawk listened to the arguments without comment. Finally, he raised a hand, silencing the room with a simple gesture. "The white man's law is a strange thing," he said. "It speaks of justice but serves power. Yet sometimes it can be turned against itself." He nodded to Mallister. "The Lakota will stand with you, Colonel. Not because we want your battles, but because Hargrove threatens the water that gives life to all." "Thank you, Chief," Mallister acknowledged. "We'll move at first light." As the meeting dispersed, the homesteaders departing to prepare for the coming confrontation, Grace drew Mallister aside. "You didn't tell them everything," she observed quietly. "They know what they need to know," he replied. "And the rest? The part where you place yourself directly in Hargrove's path?" Mallister's expression softened slightly. "Would you have had me announce that I'm offering myself as bait? They need confidence, not doubt." "And what about my confidence?" Grace challenged. "As your physician and partner, don't I deserve the full truth?" He studied her for a long moment. "You're right," he conceded, "but this is the only way. Hargrove wants me, has always wanted me. If I give him what he wants, it creates an opening." "An opening that could get you killed," Grace pointed out. "Your condition?" "My condition is precisely why this makes sense," Mallister interrupted. "I'm already dying, Grace. Let me make that mean something." It was the first time he had used her given name, the intimacy of it momentarily silencing her objections. She recognized in his eyes the same resolute acceptance she'd seen in terminal patients. Not a desire for death, but a determination to meet it on their own terms. "There must be another way," she insisted nonetheless. "If you find one before dawn, I'm listening." His hand briefly touched her shoulder. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow will demand everything from all of us." But rest proved elusive. Throughout the night, Grace tended to the Mueller children, particularly young Carl, whose respiratory infection had worsened. As she applied mustard plasters and administered herbal remedies, her mind worked relentlessly, seeking alternatives to Mallister's dangerous gambit. Dawn broke with no revelation. Outside the cabin, homesteaders prepared for the day's confrontation, checking weapons, securing wagons, distributing the precious ammunition Peterson had retrieved from a hidden cache. The Lakota had arrived in greater numbers than expected, 30 warriors with their own grievances against Hargrove. Grace found Mallister by the well, taking his morning medication with methodical precision. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed. "Neither have you," she countered, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "Your cough? Nothing I can't manage." He tucked the medicine vial into his pocket. "Did you find that alternative strategy?" "No," she admitted reluctantly, "but I've modified yours." Mallister raised an eyebrow. "Modified how?" "I'm coming with you," Grace stated, "as your nurse and medical proxy. If Hargrove truly wants this confrontation to be public, my presence adds legitimacy to our position. It also puts you directly in danger." "I spent 4 years in field hospitals where enemy shells landed regularly," she reminded him. "Danger and I are well acquainted." Mallister looked as if he might argue further, but a series of racking coughs overtook him. When they subsided, he found Grace offering a handkerchief, her expression both professional and concerned. "You need me there," she said simply. "Don't waste energy arguing." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You're a formidable woman, Miss Whitmore." "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm still alive." Pine Ridge stirred with unusual activity for a Tuesday morning. Wagons lined the main street, homesteaders mingling with townspeople who sensed the tension in the arse without fully understanding its source. Outside the territorial courthouse, a 2-story clapboard building that also housed Judge Wallace's offices, Hargrove's men lounged with deliberate menace. Inside, Judge Wallace sat behind his imposing desk, perspiration beading on his forehead despite the early hour. Before him stood General William Hargrove, immaculate in a black suit that emphasized his military bearing, and Reed, his foreman, dust-covered from the morning's evictions. 15 properties secured, Reed was reporting. Most didn't resist once they saw the court orders. "And those who did?" Hargrove inquired, his Virginia accent more pronounced than usual, a sign of satisfaction, Wallace knew. "Dealt with appropriately," Reed replied with a thin smile. "Made examples where needed." "Excellent." Hargrove turned his attention to the judge. "You've done well, Wallace. When the territorial governor reviews the situation, he'll find everything in perfect legal order." Wallace dabbed at his face with a handkerchief. "There are procedures, William, due process. If these homesteaders appeal—" "To whom?" Hargrove interrupted smoothly. "The circuit court isn't due for 6 months. By then, these claims will be fully incorporated into Hargrove Holdings, with improvements documented and taxes paid." He placed a leather pouch on the desk, the clink of coins unmistakable. "Your consideration in expediting matters is appreciated." The judge eyed the pouch but didn't touch it. "And Mallister, his claim is the most defensible." "Colonel Mallister is a dying man grasping at his brother's dream," Hargrove dismissed. "By week's end, he'll be gone, one way or another." A commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices, the shuffle of many feet on the wooden sidewalk. Reed moved to the window. "Trouble," he announced. "Mallister's here with a crowd." Hargrove straightened his already impeccable jacket. "Right on schedule. The colonel always did have a flair for confrontation." "What are you going to do?" Wallace asked nervously. "Exactly what the situation requires," Hargrove replied. "Justice will be served, Judge. I guarantee it." He strode from the office with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, Reed following like a well-trained hound. Wallace remained seated, staring at the leather pouch with a mixture of avarice and apprehension. After a moment's hesitation, he swept it into his desk drawer and rose to follow, straightening his robes with trembling hands. Outside, the street had transformed into an impromptu public forum. Homesteaders formed a loose semicircle before the courthouse, their faces set with determination. Curious townspeople gathered at the edges, sensing historic events unfolding. Most surprising to Wallace were the Lakota warriors positioned strategically throughout the crowd, a sight unprecedented in Pine Ridge. At the center stood Colonel Mallister, ramrod straight despite his illness, his faded Union coat a deliberate choice that reminded onlookers of his military service. Beside him stood Grace, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the frontier women around her. Hargrove emerged onto the courthouse steps, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. For a long moment, the two men, once friends, now mortal enemies, regarded each other across the dusty street. Colonel Mallister, Hargrove broke the silence. I see you've organized a little demonstration. How theatrical. This isn't theater, General, Mallister replied, his voice carrying clearly. It's a legal petition. These homesteaders, American citizens and veterans, demand redress for illegal seizure of their rightfully claimed lands. Illegal? Hargrove affected surprise. Every action has been sanctioned by the territorial court. He gestured to Wallace, who reluctantly stepped forward. Isn't that correct, Judge? Before Wallace could respond, Mallister countered, we're aware of the court orders obtained through methods that would interest a federal grand jury. But we're not here to debate corruption. He pulled a document from inside his coat. We're here to present evidence of water rights violations affecting treaty lands. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Hargrove's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Treaty lands? You mean the reservation? He sneered. What business is that of yours, Colonel? It became my business when your dam destroyed my property, Mallister replied evenly, and it became federal business when that same dam interfered with guaranteed water rights under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Running Hawk stepped forward, his dignity commanding immediate attention. Lakota water stolen, Lakota hunting grounds flooded. This breaks treaty between my people and Great Father in Washington. Hargrove's face darkened. You dare bring savages into a legal dispute between white men? They bring themselves, Grace interjected, her clear voice cutting through rising tensions. As is their right under federal law. Chief Running Hawk has filed a formal complaint with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, documenting systematic water theft affecting reservation lands. Preposterous, Hargrove dismissed. Wallace explained to these people that Indian complaints hold no weight in territorial matters. The judge stepped forward nervously. Actually, General, treaty violations do fall under federal jurisdiction. If the Bureau becomes involved, when the Bureau becomes involved, Mallister corrected, Marshal Davies left for Cheyenne yesterday with comprehensive documentation. By week's end, federal investigators will arrive. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Hargrove's face, quickly masked by contempt. An empty threat. The territorial government has always managed its own affairs. Not when it concerns treaty obligations, Mallister countered. Not when a decorated Union officer files formal charges of corruption and fraud. You overestimate your influence, Colonel, Hargrove said coldly. Your distinguished service record is matched only by your brother's spectacular failures. This homestead scheme was doomed from inception. Was it? Mallister produced another document. This certified letter from the Department of the Interior confirms that Timothy Mallister's water survey has been incorporated into federal records. The underground aquifer he mapped is now officially recognized as a distinct water source from Cottonwood Creek, a source you cannot legally dam or divert. This revelation clearly caught Hargrove off guard. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as he calculated this unexpected development. Convenient paperwork, he finally replied, but paperwork doesn't change reality. Your homestead was substantially damaged in a natural disaster. Under territorial law, that constitutes abandonment. A natural disaster engineered by the deliberate construction of an unsafe dam, Grace challenged, a fact documented by professional engineers from Denver, whose report has already been forwarded to the governor's office. Mallister stepped forward, closing the distance between them. It's over, William. The water rights violations alone will trigger a federal investigation. The fraudulent evictions will bring criminal charges. Your friends in the territorial government won't risk their careers to protect you. For a moment, something like genuine regret flickered across Hargrove's aristocratic features. You always were tenacious, Everett. Even at West Point, you never knew when to concede defeat. Some principles aren't negotiable, Mallister replied quietly. You taught me that once. Before you betrayed everything we stood for, Hargrove's voice dropped, meant only for Mallister's ears. Before you let my son die. I tried to save him, Mallister answered, equally low, just as I tried to save you. And yet here we are. Hargrove's hand moved subtly toward his coat, where a derringer bulged almost imperceptibly. Still at war after all these years. Grace, watching intently, recognized the motion for what it was. Without hesitation, she stepped between the men. General Hargrove, as Colonel Mallister's physician, I must insist this confrontation end. His condition is terminal, Hargrove interrupted harshly, as is his claim. Reed, sensing his employer's intent, moved his hand to his holster. The atmosphere charged instantly, homesteaders tensing, Lakota warriors shifting their stances. Judge Wallace, belatedly recognizing the dangerous precipice, intervened. "This is a courthouse, gentlemen. There will be no violence here." Hargrove held Mallister's gaze for one more heartbeat, then deliberately removed his hand from his coat. "The judge is correct. This is a place of law." His voice resumed its public cadence. "And the law will determine the outcome. In the meantime, my men will continue securing abandoned properties as directed by court order." "Your men will withdraw immediately," countered a new voice from the edge of the crowd. All heads turned to see Marshal Davies dismounting from a lathered horse, dusty from hard riding. Behind him came four uniformed cavalry officers, their federal insignia gleaming in the morning sun. "Marshal," Hargrove acknowledged coldly, "your presence is unexpected." "I'm sure it is," Davies replied, approaching the courthouse steps. "Captain Reynolds and his men are here at the request of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate alleged treaty violations." He produced an official document. "This federal injunction temporarily halts all water diversions affecting reservation lands and freezes all property transfers pending investigation." The crowd stirred with renewed hope. Hargrove's face hardened to granite. "Furthermore," Davies continued, "Judge Wallace is temporarily relieved of duties concerning water and land disputes by order of the territorial governor." He fixed the corpulent judge with a stern look. "Certain financial irregularities require review." Wallace blanched, his jowls quivering with indignation and fear. "This is outrageous. I am the appointed judicial authority." "Who accepted bribes to falsify abandonment orders," Davies interrupted. "A federal offense, Your Honor." "You can prove nothing," Wallace blustered. "We don't need to," Grace interjected, stepping forward. "Your clerk provided copies of all relevant documents, along with detailed records of payments received." This revelation struck Wallace like a physical blow. He staggered back, collapsing heavily onto the courthouse steps, all pretense of dignity abandoned. Hargrove, however, maintained his composure. "An interesting performance, Marshal, but ultimately meaningless. These homesteaders still lost everything in the flood. Most lack the resources to rebuild." "That's where you're wrong," called a voice from the crowd. Martha Jenkins pushed forward, accompanied by her sons and several prominent Pine Ridge businessmen. "The Merchants Association has established a rebuilding fund," she announced. "Loans and materials for every affected homestead, repayable over 5 years." "The association has no such resources," Hargrove scoffed. "It does now," affirmed a distinguished gentleman in an Eastern suit, the bank president. "A consortium of Cheyenne investors has provided backing, secured against future production." Mallister smiled faintly. Timothy's friends in Washington came through after all. Hargrove's mask of confidence finally cracked. He surveyed the crowd, calculating odds with a strategist's eye. The homesteaders, the Lakota, the federal officers, the unexpected financial intervention. Each element alone might have been surmountable, but together they formed an insurmountable obstacle. "This isn't over," he stated flatly, turning to Mallister. "Not between us." "It could be," Mallister offered quietly. "The past is past, William. Let it rest with the dead." For a moment, something almost human flickered in Hargrove's eyes, a glimpse of the man who had once been Everett Mallister's closest friend. Then it vanished, replaced by cold determination. "Never," he replied simply. With a curt nod to Reed, he descended the courthouse steps and strode toward his waiting horse, his bearing still every inch the Confederate general. The crowd parted instinctively, no one willing to block his path despite the victory. As he mounted, Hargrove surveyed the assembled homesteaders one last time. "Remember this day?" he called. "Remember what happens when you challenge your betters." His gaze locked with Mallister's across the distance. "Some debts can only be paid in blood, Colonel. I'll collect mine soon enough." With that ominous promise, he wheeled his horse and galloped out of town, Reed and a handful of loyal men following in his wake. The tension broken, the crowd erupted in cheers and congratulations. Homesteaders embraced, plans for rebuilding already being discussed. Martha Jenkins organized the distribution of supplies from the Merchants Association, while Captain Reynolds conferred with Chief Running Hawk about the restoration of water flow to reservation lands. Grace, however, noticed Mallister swaying slightly, his face ashen beneath its weathered tan. She moved to his side, discreetly offering support. "You need rest," she murmured. "You've pushed yourself too far." "Worth it," he replied, his voice barely audible above the celebration. "Timothy would have been proud of this day." "He would," Grace agreed, "but it's not over yet. Hargrove won't surrender so easily." No, Mallister acknowledged, allowing her to guide him toward their wagon. That wasn't surrender, it was tactical retreat. His breathing grew labored as another coughing spell threatened. He'll strike again, something decisive. Let's worry about that after you've rested, Grace insisted, helping him onto the wagon seat. She signaled Muller to bring his family, the homestead temporarily forgotten in the need to get Mallister proper care. As they left town, Marshal Davies rode alongside briefly. You did well, Colonel, both of you. We bought time, Mallister corrected, nothing more. Sometimes time is all you need, Davies replied. The cavalry detachment will remain until the federal investigators arrive. Hargrove can't move openly against you now. Then he'll move in shadows, Mallister predicted. Watch the water, Marshal. Always the water. Davies nodded grimly and reined his horse back toward the courthouse, where Captain Reynolds awaited his guidance. The return journey passed in weary silence. Grace monitored Mallister's condition with growing concern, noting the increased frequency of his coughing and the bluish tinge to his lips, signs of failing oxygenation. He needed complete rest, medication, and careful nursing. Instead, he had spent hours in confrontation, exposed to dust and stress. As they crested the final rise overlooking their homestead, Grace felt a momentary surge of relief. The cabin stood peaceful in the afternoon sun, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The rebuilt barn, though still missing part of its roof, provided some sense of normalcy. The fields, while damaged, showed signs of recovery. Then she noticed something odd. The cabin door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. No one should have been there. All the homesteaders had been in town. Mallister noticed it too, his soldier's instincts instantly alert despite his exhaustion. Something's wrong, he murmured, reaching for his rifle. As they drew closer, other details emerged. Boot prints in the soft earth around the well. A window shutter hanging askew. Most alarmingly, the distinct smell of coal oil. Get back, Mallister ordered suddenly, reining the horses to a halt. Everyone, away from the cabin. Grace had just enough time to register his urgency when a blinding flash erupted from within the cabin. The concussion wave hit them seconds later, the explosion shattering windows and sending burning debris skyward. Horses reared in panic as a ball of flame engulfed the structure, black smoke billowing into the clear blue sky. My God, Muller gasped, clutching his children close. Grace stared in horror as their home, everything they had worked to build and rebuild, was consumed by deliberately set flames. Mallister's expression turned to stone, his eyes reflecting the dancing fire. Hargrove, he stated with absolute certainty, his parting gift. As they watched helplessly, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, the same vantage point where they had first glimpsed Hargrove after the flood. Though too far to identify with certainty, the military posture was unmistakable. He remained for several minutes, observing the destruction, before turning his horse and disappearing over the horizon. Everything's gone, Grace whispered, the magnitude of the loss washing over her. All of Timothy's medical supplies, his journals, our provisions. Not everything, Mallister replied, his voice strangely calm. Hargrove still doesn't know about the cave, about what Timothy really discovered. He turned to her, a new resolve hardening his features despite his obvious illness. This isn't the end, Grace. It's just the beginning of the real fight. In the smoking ruins of their hopes, with winter approaching and resources depleted, his words should have sounded like empty bravado. Instead, they carried the weight of absolute conviction, the same conviction that had once led armies into battle against impossible odds. What do we do now, she asked, medical pragmatism reasserting itself. You need shelter, medication. First we survive, Mallister interrupted. Then we rebuild, stronger than before. He coughed violently, blood speckling his handkerchief. Yet his determination never wavered. And then we finish what Timothy started, something that will change this valley forever. As the cabin collapsed into flaming ruins, Grace realized that the true battle for the homestead, for the future of the entire valley, had only just begun. And its outcome would depend on a race against two implacable enemies, William Hargrove's vendetta and Everett Mallister's advancing disease. The question was, which would claim victory first? The Muller barn became their temporary shelter, hastily converted to accommodate both families. The structure was crude, drafty, and cramped, but it provided protection from the increasingly cold nights as September yielded to October. The community rallied around them, bringing supplies, helping to construct a stone hearth, offering what comfort they could in the aftermath of Hargrove's vindictive destruction. For Grace, the loss of her medical supplies represented the most immediate crisis. With winter approaching and Mallister's condition deteriorating, she required medicines that weren't readily available in Pine Ridge. Marshall Davies had promised a telegraph for supplies from Cheyenne, but they wouldn't arrive for weeks. On this particular morning, she knelt beside Mallister's cot, concern evident in her professional assessment. His fever had risen during the night, the rattling in his lungs more pronounced. Each labored breath seemed to cost him more energy than the last. "You need proper treatment," she insisted, wringing out a cloth in cool water and placing it on his forehead. "We should get you to Cheyenne, to a hospital." "No hospitals," Mallister replied between coughs. "No time. There's nothing more important than your health." "There's the homestead," he interrupted. "Timothy's legacy, the future of this valley." With visible effort, he pushed himself to a sitting position. "Help me up." "You're in no condition to—" "Grace?" The use of her first name stopped her objections. "I need to show you something today, while I still can." The gravity in his voice convinced her more than his words. She helped him dress, noting with clinical detachment how his clothes hung loose on his frame. In just weeks, the disease had accelerated, consuming muscle and vitality with terrifying efficiency. Outside, the morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn. The burned ruins of their cabin stood as a stark reminder of Hargrove's malice. Blackened timbers jutting like broken bones against the clear blue sky. Mueller was already at work, salvaging what nails and hardware he could from the ashes. "We're riding to the cave," Mallister announced, moving toward the corral where their horses had been sheltered. "The cave? In your condition?" Grace protested. "Especially in my condition." He checked the saddle cinch with practiced hands that nonetheless trembled slightly. "What I need to show you can't wait any longer." Grace knew better than to argue further. Whatever drove this man, this stubborn, principled, dying man, was more powerful than any medical advice she could offer. She saddled her own horse and followed him, carrying a bag of what few medical supplies remained to her. They rode in silence, Mallister conserving his strength for the journey. The landscape had recovered somewhat from the flood, though evidence remained in displaced rocks and altered stream beds. Nature's resilience impressed Grace, like the homesteaders themselves. The land endured, adapted, persisted. The cave entrance appeared unchanged, half hidden among rocky outcroppings. Mallister dismounted with difficulty, leaning against his saddle to catch his breath before retrieving a lantern from his saddlebag. "Timothy discovered this place last winter," he explained as they entered the cool darkness. "At first, he thought it was just an underground spring, valuable enough in this country, but his exploration revealed something far more significant. They proceeded deeper than they had on previous visits, following the main passage until it narrowed considerably. Mallister paused before a tight crevice Grace hadn't noticed before. "Through here," he directed, squeezing himself into the opening with obvious discomfort. Grace followed, the rough stones scraping her shoulders as they navigated the constricted space. After about 15 feet, the passage widened abruptly into a large chamber, the lantern light revealing a breathtaking sight. Massive crystalline formations hung from the ceiling and rose from the floor, catching the light in prismatic reflections. A substantial underground stream flowed across one side of the cavern, disappearing into the rock wall. But most striking were the markings, ancient paintings covering the walls in ochre, white, and black pigments. They depicted humans, animals, and symbols Grace didn't recognize. "My God," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "And old," Mallister added. Running Elk believes these paintings are from his people's ancestors. Perhaps thousands of years ago, they considered this place sacred, a gateway to the spirit world. "Is this what Timothy discovered? Ancient cave paintings?" "No." Mallister moved deeper into the chamber, raising his lantern toward the far wall where the underground stream emerged. "This is what he found." In the lantern light, Grace saw a dark substance seeping from the rock face, mixing with the flowing water. It had the consistency of thick molasses and carried a distinctive odor, sharp and pungent. "Oil," she realized. "Petroleum." "Exactly." Mallister dipped his finger into the substance, rubbing it between thumb and forefinger. Timothy recognized it immediately from his geology studies. An underground petroleum deposit, seeping naturally into the water system. "That's why the water sometimes has that distinctive smell," Grace reasoned. "The oil is mixing with the aquifer." "In small quantities, yes, but Timothy believed there's a vast deposit beneath this entire valley." Mallister's eyes gleamed in the lantern light, enough to rival the Pennsylvania fields. Grace immediately grasped the implications. If there's oil here, then this land is worth far more than cattle pasture or even farmland, Mallister confirmed. Timothy documented everything, the geological formations, the likely extent of the deposit. He sent his findings to former colleagues at Harvard for confirmation. And Hargrove, does he know? I don't believe so. His obsession has always been land accumulation for cattle operations. He's a man of the past, plantation thinking applied to Western ranching. Mallister set the lantern on a flat rock, but others will recognize the potential. The railroad companies, Eastern investors. This discovery could transform the entire territory. Grace circled the chamber slowly, processing this revelation. Is this why you fought so hard for the homestead? For the oil? No. Mallister's response was immediate and firm. I fought for Timothy's dream, a medical practice serving this valley, a community where people could build lives of dignity. The oil is simply the means to ensure that vision survives. How? Mallister extracted a folded document from his coat pocket, handling it with reverence. Timothy's final testament. He established a trust with provisions that any mineral rights discovered on homestead land be developed for the benefit of the entire valley. Schools, medical facilities, infrastructure. He passed the paper to Grace. He named me executor with authority to designate a successor. Grace unfolded the document, reading by lantern light. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. Timothy Mallister had created a framework for communal prosperity rather than personal enrichment. He was an idealist, she murmured. He was a visionary, Mallister corrected. He saw what this country could become if developed with justice rather than greed. A sudden coughing spell seized him, more violent than before. Grace moved quickly to support him as he doubled over, blood speckling his handkerchief in alarming quantity. We need to get you back, she insisted when the spell subsided. Mallister nodded weakly, his strength visibly fading. Grace, I'm naming you my successor as executor. The document is in my saddlebag, requiring only your signature and Davy's witness. Everett, please. There's no one else I trust, he interrupted. No one with both the medical knowledge and moral clarity this responsibility demands. Before she could respond, a voice echoed from the passageway behind them. Colonel Mallister, Dr. Whitmore. It was Mueller, his German accent amplified by the cave acoustics. Here, Grace called back, in the main chamber. Moments later, the German emerged from the narrow crevice, breathing heavily from exertion. His face was taut with urgency. Riders coming, he reported. Many riders, Hargrove men with guns. Mallister straightened with visible effort. How many? 15, maybe 20. Marshal Davies rides to reservation for help, but too far. Muller's eyes reflected the lantern light. They come to finish what they started. Grace's mind raced through options. We can stay here. They might not know about the cave. They'll find it, Mallister countered. Or worse, hold the Mueller family hostage until we emerge. He turned to Mueller. Your wife and children? Hidden in root cellar at Peterson Farm, Mueller replied. But our homestead, our animals. Mallister made his decision with military efficiency. Get back to the barn. Gather whatever weapons we have. Alert any neighbors within reach. And you? We'll return immediately. He folded the trust document carefully, returning it to his pocket. Grace helped me to my horse. Outside, the peaceful autumn morning had turned ominous. Dust clouds marked the approach of riders from the direction of Hargrove's ranch, still several miles distant but closing rapidly. They're coming in force, Grace observed as they mounted. This isn't just intimidation. No, Mallister agreed grimly. Hargrove knows he's lost the legal battle, with federal authorities involved and his judicial allies compromised. He's making his final move. He wheezed slightly as they urged their horses forward. This ends today, one way or another. They rode hard, reaching the homestead minutes before the Hargrove contingent arrived. Mueller had gathered what firearms they possessed: 2 rifles, a shotgun, and Mallister's army revolver. Peterson had arrived with his 3 grown sons, adding their weapons to the meager arsenal. 7 men, 9 guns, Mallister assessed, against 20. Running elk comes with warriors, Mueller reported, but maybe 1 hour, 2 hours. Mallister nodded, calculating odds with a tactician's eye. We need to delay. Hold position as long as possible. He surveyed their surroundings, focusing on the barn and nearby outbuildings. Peterson, get your boys on the roof. Better angle there. Mueller, take the west approach. Grace? I'm staying with you, she stated firmly, checking the shotgun with practiced hands. He didn't waste energy arguing. Watch the eastern flank. They'll try to surround us. They had barely taken positions when the riders appeared, spreading out in a wide arc as they approached. Reed led them, his drooping mustache visible, even at distance. Conspicuously absent was Hargrove himself, an unexpected development that immediately put Mallister on alert. "Where's the general?" he muttered. He wouldn't miss this confrontation. The riders halted just beyond effective rifle range. Reed raised his voice to carry across the distance. "Mallister, your time's up. The general says you've got 5 minutes to clear out. Take your woman and any personal effects. Everything else stays." "This is legal homestead land," Peterson shouted back. "Federally protected. You have no authority here." Reed's laugh carried on the breeze. "Federal authorities ain't it here, old man. And there's 20 of us against your pitiful handful." He raised his rifle for emphasis. 5 minutes, then we burn what's left." Grace positioned herself at a small window, shotgun ready. "They mean to kill us," she observed clinically. "No matter what we do." "Yes," Mallister confirmed, checking his revolver. "Hargrove has crossed the final line. This is extermination, not eviction." An unsettling realization struck her. "You expected this. You've been preparing for it." Mallister met her gaze steadily. "I've known William Hargrove for 40 years. When legal means fail him, violence is inevitable." He coughed again, wincing at the pain, "which is why I took precautions." Before Grace could question him further, movement on the far ridge caught her attention. A single rider approached from the northeast, from the direction of Hargrove's ranch, but separate from the main force. "Everett," she called quietly. "Look there." Mallister observed a solitary figure, recognition dawning on his weathered features. "Hargrove," he confirmed. "Coming to witness, not participate, as always." The distant rider halted on the ridge, observing the scene below like a general surveying a battlefield. Reed's voice rang out again. "Time's up, Mallister. Last chance." "Tell Hargrove I want to speak with him," Mallister called back. "Face to face, man to man." Reed conferred briefly with his lieutenants, then spurred his horse toward the distant ridge. Several tense minutes passed as he conveyed the message to Hargrove, then returned to the main group. "The general agrees," Reed announced. "You alone, Mallister. Middle ground, no weapons." Grace seized Mallister's arm. "It's a trap." "Of course it is," he agreed calmly, "but it's also our only chance to buy time." He pressed his revolver into her hands. "If I fall, don't hesitate. Aim for Reed first. He's the only one the others truly follow." "Everett, you can barely stand," she protested. "Let me go instead." "This is between him and me," Mallister replied simply. "It has been since Gettysburg." With grim resolve, he straightened his faded Union coat and stepped outside, walking steadily despite his weakness. Hargrove descended from the ridge, meeting him in the open ground between the opposing forces. From her position, Grace could see but not hear the two men. Former friends, brothers in arms, now mortal enemies. They stood several feet apart, neither offering to shake hands. Their conversation appeared intense, punctuated by Mallister's occasional coughing fits. After several minutes, Hargrove gestured emphatically toward the homestead, his meaning clear: surrender the land. Mallister shook his head, then appeared to offer something else, reaching slowly into his coat to produce the trust document. Hargrove examined it, his expression changing from dismissal to shock, then calculation. He looked up sharply at Mallister, who continued speaking with evident passion despite his failing strength. Suddenly, distant hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. From the western approach came a large contingent of riders, at least 30 Lakota warriors led by Running Elk and Chief Running Hawk, with Marshal Davies and the cavalry detachment among them. Grace watched Hargrove's body language shift, the momentary slump of shoulders, the resignation of a military man recognizing an untenable position. Whatever Mallister had revealed in their conversation, combined with the arrival of reinforcements, had fundamentally altered the equation. Hargrove gestured to Reed, who reluctantly signaled their men to hold position. The general and the colonel spoke for several minutes more before Hargrove abruptly mounted his horse and rode toward his assembled force. After brief instructions, the entire contingent wheeled their horses and departed, leaving Hargrove alone on the contested ground. Mallister remained standing until the last rider disappeared over the horizon, then crumpled to his knees, strength finally exhausted. Grace rushed to his side, supporting him as he fought for breath. Marshal Davies dismounted nearby, concern evident on his weathered face. "What happened?" he demanded. "What did you say to him?" Mallister's voice was barely audible. "Offered him partnership in Timothy's vision." Partnership? Grace echoed incredulously. With Hargrove? Showed him. The trust document. Mallister's breathing grew more labored. The oil discovery explained how development could benefit everyone, including him. And he agreed? Davies asked skeptically. Not yet, Mallister managed, but he'll consider it. Hargrove is many things, but he understands future thinking. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, and he knows federal troops would arrive if he killed us all. They helped him back to the barn, where Running Hawk's wife, a respected healer among the Lakota, examined him with grave concern. She spoke quietly to Running Elk, who translated. She says his medicine spirit prepares to journey. Not much time remains. Grace accepted this assessment with professional stoicism, though her heart rebelled against its finality. She administered what medicine she had, knowing they could only ease his suffering, not alter the inevitable outcome. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the homestead, Mallister asked to be moved outside. They arranged a cot on the porch of the partially rebuilt cabin, where he could see the land he had fought to preserve. Beautiful, he murmured, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. Timothy chose well. Grace sat beside him, holding his hand as the marshal stood respectfully nearby. The trust document, she reminded him gently. You wanted me to sign. Mallister nodded weakly, and Davies produced the papers. With the marshal's pen, Grace signed where indicated, accepting the responsibility Mallister had entrusted to her. What do I do if Hargrove refuses partnership? She asked. He won't, Mallister replied with surprising certainty. William is prideful, vengeful, but never stupid. The oil changes everything. He squeezed her hand with what strength remained to him. But be vigilant, trust but verify. Davies cleared his throat. Colonel, about the federal investigators, they'll want to know everything in Timothy's journals, Mallister interrupted. In the cave, behind the large stalagmite, metal box, waterproof, complete documentation. The marshal nodded, tucking away this information. I'll make sure it reaches the proper authorities. As twilight deepened toward night, Running Hawk approached, his dignity commanding respect even in silence. He carried something wrapped in tanned hide, which he placed gently beside Mallister. Medicine pipe, the chief explained, for warrior's journey. Great Spirit knows no uniforms, only brave hearts. Mallister's eyes reflected profound gratitude. Thank you, old enemy. New friend. The chief nodded once and withdrew, leaving Grace and Mallister in the gathering darkness. For a time, they sat in companionable silence, watching the first stars appear. I'm sorry, Grace, he said finally, for bringing you into this fight. Don't be, she replied firmly. I chose to stay, remember? A faint smile touched his lips. You did. Stubbornest woman I ever met. Second only to the stubbornest man, she countered, adjusting his blanket against the evening chill. His expression grew serious. Promise me something. Anything. See it through. Timothy's vision, the medical practice, the community. His voice strengthened momentarily with conviction. This valley can be something new, something better than what we've known. I promise, Grace assured him. Though I'm only a nurse, not a visionary. You're everything this place needs, Mallister contradicted. Healer, leader, builder. His breathing hitched painfully. I wish I could have seen it, what you'll create here. So do I, she whispered, medical detachment finally crumbling as tears blurred her vision. So do I, Everett. He gazed up at the emerging stars, recognition fading from his eyes as they fixed on something beyond mortal sight. Timothy, he murmured, I kept my promise, the homestead is safe. With a final, gentle exhalation, Colonel Everett Mallister departed the battlefield of life. His long war finally concluded. Spring came to the valley with unprecedented vigor. Green shoots carpeted the once ravaged fields, nourished by snowmelt and carefully managed irrigation. The rebuilt Mallister cabin, larger and sturdier than before, stood as a testament to community resilience, its new medical wing already serving patients from throughout the region. Grace surveyed the homestead from horseback, clipboard in hand, as she checked items off her ever-growing list. The barn reconstruction was nearly complete. The underground pipeline from the cave spring was functioning perfectly. The experimental windmill, based on Timothy's designs, drew water efficiently to the surface. Most significant was the small drilling operation at the north edge of the property, where engineers from Pennsylvania worked alongside local men, including Muller and Peterson's sons, to assess the petroleum deposit's extent and quality. A rider approached from the direction of town, Marshall Davies, now a regular visitor as the federal development project progressed. Dr. Whitmore, he greeted, dismounting beside her. Productive spring you're having. Indeed, Grace agreed, tucking her clipboard into her saddlebag. The Department of the Interior's geological team confirms Timothy's assessment. The oil deposit extends throughout the Eastern Valley. Good news for the trust, Davies observed, and the Community Development Fund. And for our reluctant partner, Grace added with a wry smile, though he refuses to visit the homestead personally. Hargrove's participation in the petroleum development had surprised many, though Grace understood the calculation behind it. With federal attention focused on the region and his own legal vulnerabilities exposed, partnership offered the general a path to profit without confrontation. That his former friend had extended this olive branch from his deathbed only added layers of complexity to the arrangement. Speaking of partners, Davies said, the medical supplies you requested arrived on yesterday's train. I had them sent to your clinic. Excellent. The influenza cases in the Lakota camp need those medicines urgently. They rode together toward the cabin, where Running Elk waited with several Lakota elders. The collaboration between the reservation and the homesteaders had flourished, with Grace's medical practice serving both communities and the oil trust guaranteeing water rights protection. The territorial governor arrives next week, Davies mentioned, for the official dedication of the Mallister Medical Trust. Grace nodded, having almost forgotten the ceremony amidst her daily responsibilities. It seems rather formal for our modest operation. There's nothing modest about what you've accomplished here, Davies countered. In less than a year, you've established a functioning medical practice, coordinated oil exploration, and united communities that had been at odds for generations. I had help, Grace demurred. Yes, Davies agreed, glancing toward the small cemetery on the hillside where two wooden crosses stood side by side. But the vision is yours now. As they approached the cabin, Grace's gaze swept across the bustling homestead, Muller supervising the barn construction, Hannah teaching reading to a mixed group of settler and Lakota children, petroleum engineers consulting with Lakota elders about sacred sites to be protected during development. Timothy's dream had been preservation of land and community. Everett's had been redemption and justice. But Grace's vision extended beyond both. Integration, cooperation, progress with respect for tradition. The last homestead had become not an end, but a beginning. She dismounted before the cabin door, now emblazoned with a simple sign. Mallister Medical Clinic, Grace Whitmore, M.D. The M.D. had been Davies' suggestion, acknowledging what everyone in the valley already knew, that her skills and dedication transcended formal credentials. The Territorial Medical Board had made it official the previous month, recognizing her years of battlefield experience and continuing education. Dr. Whitmore called Running Elk from the porch. The children wait for their examination. Coming, she replied, untying her medical bag from the saddle. Before joining him, she paused, looking once more across the thriving homestead to the distant crosses on the hillside. We kept our promise, she murmured to the silent guardians. Your legacy endures in this land, in these people, in what we're building together. The Wyoming wind carried her words away, but Grace knew with absolute certainty that they had been heard and understood by the brothers who had made this all possible. Their last homestead had become her first true home. And that was a legacy worth any struggle to preserve.